Hello and welcome. Bienvenidos, friends of the Hispanic Society, to Las Tertulias de Arte Hispano, or Hispanic Art Gatherings. Thank you, as always, to our members who have joined us monthly since May of 2020, and welcome to all those who are tuning in for the first time. We continue these conversations on the first Tuesday of each month at 6 p.m. If you are not a member yet, please do consider joining by giving to our website, hispanicsociety.org, and search for membership under support. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing Jerry Dodds, who will present Big Little Lies, The Myth of El Cid, the Book of Memorials of San Pedro de Cardeña and Hispanidad. Jerry Dodds is the Harlequin at our Dunman Chair. She holds the Harlequin at our Dunman Chair in the History of Art at Sarah Lawrence College. Her scholarly work has centered on issues of transculturation and how groups form identities through art and architecture, in particular in the medieval Iberian Peninsula. She has written such notable books as The Arts of Intimacy, Christians, Jews, and Muslims in the Making of Castilian Culture, Architecture and Ideology of Early Medieval Spain. She's also been involved with two exhibitions at the Met, the first Al-Andalus, The Arts of Islamic Spain, and she was co-curator of the exhibition of the same name. It happened at the Alhambra in Granada and at the Met. She was also the co-editor and editorial consultant of Arts of Medieval Spain with various scholars that happened at the Met. There are many other exhibitions which will have been important in studying this field, and it is she's written and directed films in conjunction with museum exhibitions, The Journey of St. James for the Met and Imaginary East for the Met, and she has been the recipient of the Cruz de la Orden de Mérito Civil, the Order of the Civil Merit from the government of Spain in 2018. This official biography, however, doesn't include what for me makes Jerry so special, which is that she has been my teacher as a graduate and undergraduate, introducing me to the arts of medieval Spain and shaping my view of this material, in particular, the relationship between Islamic and Christian art as that shaped a culture. And it's also been influential in my choice of visits, monuments I've gone to visit, and the picture behind me of the Aljaferia in Zaragoza is something I wouldn't have gone to if I hadn't first studied it with her. So with this context, I'm very happy and pleased to present to you, Jerry, for the talk, the Tertulia this afternoon.
Well, I'm really honored for your introduction, Patrick, especially since if there's anybody here who hasn't seen Patrick's brilliant show at the Hispanic Society, you have to come and see it right away. It's the most important and moving show I've seen in a very long time. Uh, let's see if this works. Oh, yay. So on December 31st, 2007, thousands of Spaniards chose to spend their New Year's Eve waiting hours in a frigid line for a once-in-a-lifetime chance to catch a glimpse of this manuscript, the oldest surviving copy of the Cantar de Mio Cid, the Song of the Cid, or the Poem of the Cid, as we call it in English. The poem is the oldest Castilian epic poem to survive, but its fame grows also because its subject, Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, better known by his title El Cid, has traditionally been portrayed as the Spanish national hero par excellence. And indeed, here he is, the brilliant and dramatic focal point of the plaza in front of the Hispanic Society, seated on his charger, Babieca, brandishing a battle banner. This remarkable sculpture by Anna Hyatt Huntington was based on significant research. She consulted 11th century armor in the Metropolitan Museum and the hero's reported physical characteristics to create her fabulous romantic portrait, searching out models who could match her historical vision for this powerful, valiant hero as she imagined him. And this is an actual model posing for her statue of the Cid. One senses, though, along with one researcher, that her model for the spirit of El Cid was her husband, the Hispanic Society's patron and founder, Archer Huntington, who had published a scholarly translation of the epic poem in 1897. Huntington was, after all, an energetic advocate for Spanish culture, and especially so in 1897, a moment of profound political, social, and cultural crisis in Spain, which was rapidly losing its colonies, its political power, and cultural prestige on a global stage. El Cid becomes here an image of Hispanic culture revived, or reviving. But how did El Cid become a hero who's still adopted by some today as an embodiment of something different, Hispanidad, a sort of mythic, unitary, unchanging Spanish identity? As here, former Spanish President José María Aznar is pictured in an article published before his presidency, a young politician dressed as El Cid. We'll return to this later. The process of the conflation of that image of El Cid with a mythic identity began long before there was a Spain. In 12th century manuscripts from the monastery shown here of San Pedro de Cardeña, in the collection of the Hispanic Society, we can see a clue to the creation of this image of Rodrigo Diaz. The manuscript is called the Book of Memorials and Anniversaries, and it brings together a number of sources, among them an evangeliary to be read at Mass, the rules of the Benedictine monastery, a martyrology, a calendar of the days when one ought to celebrate the feasts of martyrs, and the Book of Memorials and Anniversaries itself. This was an important and often used book at the monastery, and its contents were expanded from the 12th through the 14th centuries, as the Hispanic Society's curator John O'Brien, to whom I'm indebted here, has shown us. The martyrology includes these lively and inventive initials that show interlace and ingenious interweaving of vegetal forms with occasional interventions of body parts of mythological creatures, creating a fabulous cerebral puzzle for the viewer, a delightful but also a meditative art. This is an expressive language we associate more with the north of Europe than with traditions on the Iberian Peninsula. And it can be found in both northern France, as here in the Cistercian Abbey of Pontigny, and also in England. Here you have an example of the use of animal heads tucked into a maze of foliage, just as they appear in manuscripts from northern France. This style in the Hispanic Society's manuscript also links to a Bible now in Burgos and to more opulent works in the Royal Abbey of Las Huelgas de Burgos, where it appears in a more luxurious form. It's a royal abbey. Here, these connections between Northern Europe and England as well reveal something of a secret, because it is a style that was likely brought into vogue in Castile, in particular, when King Alfonso VIII of Castile married Leonor, who was the daughter of the fabulous, the notorious, the brilliant politician and mother from hell, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and her husband, Henry Plantagenet of England, who as a politician and warrior was no slouch either. The monastery of Las Huelgas was founded by Alfonso VIII and Leonor in 1187. And here we suspect they also deposited manuscripts brought from England and northern France, some of which might have filtered as models into the monastery of San Pedro de Cardeña. But the page in our compilation manuscript that focuses our attention on the Cid is different and more workaday. It includes 2 entries and a long list of people whose memory was honored by the monks with offices for the dead. Oops. Those 2 entries read, first, my Cid lies before the altar of San Pedro, and one observes his anniversary for much good that he did for this monastery, and things he obtained for us that we cherish, that kings gave us at his request. The next entry commemorates, Señora Jimena, my Cid's wife, lies as a noble lady together with my Cid, her husband. These entries mark the fact that the monks honored the Cid and his wife Jimena on June 8th, something that usually is the result of a substantial previous donation to a monastery, one made before one's death, assuring one a holy place to be buried, here in front of the altar of St. Peter, and masses that were said to ease one's travails in the afterlife, which is why the monks write, for the much good he did for the monastery, and for the good word he is said to have put in to kings at various times. But this is the first of the big little lies, because El Cid never intended to be buried at San Pedro de Cardeña, nor did he ever make a donation to the monastery, let alone compel kings to do so. So who was El Cid? The poem of the Cid, very likely about a century after the death of Rodrigo Diaz, composed a century after his death, presents us with a hero of unquestioned loyalty to his king, Alfonso VI, even when that king treats him unjustly. He's portrayed as fighting selflessly for his beloved Castile. And he is, above all, a knight who fights in the interest of Christianity. The archangel Gabriel appears to him in a dream, and his mission is ever to regain territories and cities for Christendom. But the poem, like this map, omits several interesting aspects of Rodrigo Diaz de Bibar's actual life and times. First, rather than a high-minded and selfless knight yearning to return to the good graces of his king, Rodrigo Diaz was, for most of his career, an excellent mercenary, very much out for himself. He'd been a figure from the minor nobility, with a place at the courts of King Sancho II, and then of his brother Alfonso VI. But when Rodrigo then went off the tracks, he led his men in a violent and lucrative raid against the Taifa kingdom of Toledo, ruled by the Muslim Dulmunid family, and for this he was exiled by his king. Now you might say, given the times, what was wrong with that? Well, a lot, it turns out. In this period, relationships between kingdoms ruled by Christians and those ruled by Muslims were constantly changing, and seldom based on religion alone. Alliances between Christian and Muslim kings were common, especially since the Christian rulers of the north were at times intent on killing each other. Alfonso VI, for instance, was likely responsible for the death of his brother Sancho. Now, while an alliance with a Muslim king could be quite lucrative, Christians contracted feudal pacts with Muslim rulers, in which Muslims paid parias, tribute money, and became their allies, bringing their armies to fight for their Christian lords, which the King of Toledo did for Alfonso VI. When Alfonso was exiled by his brother Sancho, he stayed with his ally, the Muslim ruler Al-Mahmun of Toledo. So when Rodrigo Diaz launched an unauthorized attack against Toledo, he was looting a valuable ally of his king without his king's permission, and for this he was exiled. And this gives you some idea of some of the sort of kaleidoscopic relationships. Okay, you might say, well, perhaps Rodrigo was so ardent an anti-Muslim advocate that he attacked Toledo in the name of Christendom anyway. Except that the first job he took in exile was a position as mercenary captain for another Muslim kingdom, for the Banu Hud of the Taifa of Zaragoza. And that's, of course, the palace that Patrick has as his background. He's shown here in a recent, slightly revisionist TV series wearing, as he surely must have, a textile of Islamic manufacture. And he's shown here where the series was shot in the Aljaferia, the palace of the Taifa kings of Zaragoza. And we can have a better view of that right there. Here's the palace of the Aljaferia, now the site of the Cortes de Aragon, by the way. But in the 11th century, the Taifa court in which El Cid served. Rodrigo served the Banu Hud, in fact, with great distinction, and fought not only against their Muslim foes, but also against Christian enemies of Zaragoza. He defeated both Count Berenguer Ramon II of Barcelona and King Sancho Ramirez of Aragon in the interests of his Muslim lord, and he later ravaged Christian Rioja with fire and sword in 1092 when King Alfonso of Castile upset him. There's no hint of this clearly in the poem, which has him taken in by none other than the monks of San Pedro de Cardeña when first in exile. And Rodrigo was far from the only freelance soldier of fortune to make a career on both sides of the religious line. This amazing Cordoba casket of silver and yellow probably arrived in the city of Girona in Catalonia as partial payment for just this kind of service when Catalan troops fought on the side of Muhammad II to the south in Cordoba. Much later, the Pope would issue fierce letters against soldiers who fought on the side of Muslim armies, but to little avail. The product of these interactions, no matter how self-serving they were, was a shared culture, arts, language, letters, military strategy. Look at this textile from the Hispanic Society's collection. It's an aljuba, a silk tunic of Nasrid manufacture with the Arabic inscription al-yum, happiness, sort of like a Hallmark card greeting of the time. This tunic belonged to Prince Philip of Castile in the 13th century. It was not a textile won in war. It was a gift from his Muslim ally. And this is a 12th century garment of Don Garcia de Castile, a son of Alfonso VII. When he became rich, Rodrigo might well have worn something like this, a special tunic worn for riding. It fit the body closely down to the hips, where it split and flared out for sitting on horseback. A priceless silk with double-headed eagles and Kufic inscriptions. Almost every royal burial from medieval Castile featured Castilian kings and Leonese kings dressed in textiles of Islamic manufacture, some made on the frontiers specifically to supply northern lords with the latest fashion. And the royals and their knights also cherished horse trappings and weapons, myriad kinds of culture that became shared culture. Rodrigo might in particular have worn such a garment on June 15, 1094, when he rode in triumph through the city of Valencia. He'd already established a feudal relationship with Valencia under its Taifa ruler, Al-Qadir, but now he would enter the city as its own prince, moving into the Taifa palace himself. He had separated himself entirely from Castile and his king and placed himself directly under the Pope and the influence of the French, particularly a bishop named Jerome. The poema says of Jerome, by the way, that he came to Valencia hoping to kill a Muslim or two, sounding a little like the dwarf Gimli in The Lord of the Rings counting his dead orcs. But far from fighting for Castile or Christendom in history, Rodrigo was building his own country, his own kingdom, separate from Castile. Scholars today agree that it's very unlikely that he saw himself as a figure driven to rid the peninsula of Muslims, as Charlton Heston is here, pictured with a crusader's symbol on his vest. Militarily, Rodrigo's operations were brilliant, but also, in the words of the much lamented Simon Barton, altogether devoid of the heroic, the pious, the patriotic content he's represented in the poem as having. When he died, he was buried in the Cathedral of Valencia, as he had wished, the Prince of Valencia. It was only as the city was overrun by Almoravid forces in 1102 that Jimena had his body exhumed and brought it east to the monastery of San Pedro de Cardeña. There she made donations to the monastery so that his body and her own would be received. We hear very little from Cardeña until a generation or two later, when in the 12th century, King Alfonso VII, shown here in a unique manuscript from the collection of the Hispanic Society, it's an amazing image, King Alfonso VII would try to give the monastery of San Pedro de Cardeña away to the French monastery of Cluny in payment of a debt of sorts. Cardeña's monks and their abbot Martin resisted this takeover ardently, but they finally had to free the monastery as French Cluniacs occupied it. After years, they finally won a suit against Cluny at the Papal Curia in 1146. The Cluniacs were forced to leave, which they did, taking with them all of the treasure of the monastery. But when they left this new monastic cloister, its unusual arcades ornamented with red and white stones, banded arches, we tend to call them. And they look like the arcades of the Great Mosque of Cordoba or the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, emblems both, for the French, of the fight against Muslims and the First Crusade. The banded arches of Cardeña here are something like a reminder of Islam as something exotic. Iberians in this period did not always see Muslims in terms of crusade or reconquest. But the French Cluniacs and the papacy were seeking to spark crusades on Spanish soil. So the fashioning of Muslims, not as different groups of people who were sometimes your enemy and sometimes your ally, but as a single other, this was an ideological leap more easily made by Frenchmen than by Castilians. And so it is monks from France who created this cloister that suggested a monastic mission in opposition to Islam. So when the monks of Cardeña returned, they were left with this message, one that was starting to be supported by the monarchy. They were left with the message in red and white masonry, one of Islam as an exotic other, and also with a monastery stripped bare, its treasure pillaged, not by Muslims, but by French clerics. They had few resources. They needed to rework their business model. And that is what that's when it probably occurred to them that they had an asset in the bodies of Rodrigo and Jimena, whom juglares, minstrels, were already making into legendary heroes. They began to develop their new brand. They fashioned fake news, a legend of 300 monks martyred by Muslims instead of displaced by French Cluniacs, whose cloister bled once a year, and enhancing the growing myth of the Cid as a sacred, miraculous figure who fought for Christianity, hoping to attract pilgrims, lords, and kings, and increasing their prestige as a monastery. The tombs at the monastery multiplied to include Rodrigo's relatives and his companions at arms, and even a legend about his horse Babieca, the name which adorably means, for many people, stupid, who was also, by tradition, buried on the monastic grounds. So we've come full circle to that moment shortly before the year 1200, when the miniatures from the Hispanic Society's manuscript were made, reflecting fashion for French and English styles, perhaps encouraged by Lenore, Alfonso VIII's wife. Now that same king would soon fight a battle against Almohad forces as a crusade, for the atmosphere in medieval Iberia was changing. The papal and Cluniac ideas of crusade and reconquest were now adopted by Castilian monarchs when it suited them. And at San Pedro de Cardeña, the monks would in time record the day that they commemorated El Cid and the great good he did for the monastery. But that turns out to be not so much his donations. Instead, the good turns out to be the monastic revival that his body and cult were giving to the monastery over a century after his death. Rodrigo, Mio Cid, had been refashioned as the champion of Christendom that he was not in his lifetime, not just at Cardeña, of course, but throughout Castile. This is the growing myth of El Cid from which the epic poem was fashioned in the 12th and 13th centuries. And it is the identity to which the monks of Cardeña would cling for centuries to come. Its new 18th century facade includes the use of red and white stones, recalling the theme of the Cluniac's cloister, which is now called the Cloister of the Martyrs, now over 500 years later. And within it is a sculpture, and Patrick has some wonderful ideas about it. It could either be from the same moment or perhaps from the 17th century. A sculpture of El Cid, the dismembered bodies of Muslims beneath his horse's hooves. It is an image taken directly from the iconography of Santiago Matamoros, St. James, the killer of Moors. Poor St. James, you'll remember he was an apostle of Christ, but he received this new identity in the 13th century, about the same time that Rodrigo is recreated as a killer of Muslims in the name of Christendom. Of course, this is a later sculpture. Sorry. It is also like a vivid image of Santiago from the Hispanic Society's collection from the letters of patent nobility of Gaspar Guerra de Cañamal in 1610. Santiago here, 1 year after the expulsion of the Moriscos in 1609. These images emerged from the moment in which heroes and saints are mustered in an ethnic cleansing of a minority and an erasure of Spain's rich and messy history. And this is the image of El Cid that some have brought into the 20th century with them today. El Cid is still being used today by a few to embody a symbol of an imperial, culturally cleansed Hispanidad. I think it would be a good idea for us to take him back. We can see El Cid as history does, an enterprising man of his time, working for both Muslims and Christians in a moment in which Castilian identity and culture were diverse and their politics dynamic. Or he can be the myth of a cleansed Iberian identity formed around the idea of an opposition to Islam and in opposition to others who do not conform with that mythic history. Spain no longer celebrates a Dia de Hispanidad because the concept excluded the multiple languages and cultures of the Iberian Peninsula. On October 12th, the Hispanic Society celebrated Indigenous Peoples Day as part of its own mission of inclusion. This institution, after all, is a celebration of the many societies touched by Iberian language and culture in Europe, the Western Hemisphere, and Asia. The collection embraces a kaleidoscope of relations with others, with Muslims and Jews, with Christians who spoke Arabic and those who spoke Romance, with, among others, Basques and Catalanes, and it reaches out to the thousands of indigenous languages and cultures in the New World without erasing their devastating histories through conquest. Here we honor an ever-growing, ever-changing galaxy of cultures. So I'd like to say in closing that the historical El Cid fits the Hispanic Society's mission just fine. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. That was very interesting, and it's quite a survey to see the way the different religions, the different camps bleed over religion and politics. And as you talked, I was struck that in a certain sense, the saint-making process, as you described it, is also similarly flexible as opportunity arises. That the Cid is basically, they don't have the relic of a saint, so let's go with the Cid is almost what seems to be in operation. And it, as you mentioned, the juglar, of course, one thinks of how someone like Gonzalo de Berceo is writing poems about the various saints, but the tradition can go also back across to epic military deeds. And so the Cid, it makes one think that the division between sacred and secular that we have perhaps in a post-Victorian world is much more fluid. And if you rethink that, then some of the alliances across the board that happened also are less problematic. The other thing that hit me as you presented the career of the Cid is that actually it's not so much that he fought Toledo that's surprising. It's that he managed to oust the local families in Valencia to make himself the king there. That's the more daring and unexpected achievement, because I mean, the taifas are the local entrenched oligarchs, in effect, whether Christian or Muslim, and he managed to take them down. I mean, it's militarily quite an achievement.
I think can you hear me? Am I on? I think he did this. I think he was able to do this because Al-Qadr was actually very weak, and he had a very tenuous grasp on his power, and there was internal strife at the time.
Yeah.
Plus, everybody was nervous about the other forces coming up from the south. So he was very smart. I think he took advantage of of a a sort of hole in their thing.
Well, that seems to be the story with the taifas, that they don't have no one. They are so fragile because nobody ever seems to have a very secure power base, and
And they were paying him tribute already.
yeah.
Yeah.
As you spoke, I was curious. When do the Cluniacs get kicked out of Cardeña, and when do the monks return approximately?
1146.
1146. All right. Because the other question is that the impetus, if you look at it from the later world of the late medieval and the Renaissance, what's always surprising is that Fernando III, the Holy One,
Mhm.
conquers Seville, and they could have finished the job off right there in the 1200s, but they stopped because it was more lucrative
Right.
to get the money.
Yeah.
And in a sense, I wonder how that affects the myth making of the Cid, because it was they were the Islamic regimes are the source of money that's fueling so much of the northern Christian economy. And
It's absolutely true what you say. You know what happens is Almoravids come
yeah,
and they start wiping out the Taifa. They start wiping out the Taifas, and
yeah,
then people like Alfonso VI start actually occupying the Taifas. So he occupies Toledo, but
yeah,
then he doesn't. But then he he doesn't get Parayas anymore, and he gets poor. The
yeah.
reason Alfonso VII the reason Alfonso VII tries to give Cardeña to the Cluniacs, which is like totally against any canon law, was because he doesn't have this tribute money anymore, and the Cluniacs are saying, "Hey, you guys used to give us all this tribute money, and we're saying masses for all of your family, and you have to give." He didn't have the money, so he tried to pawn off a monastery that actually didn't belong to him. Royal economy.
Uh, that's quite a bit of daring there to. But the you, the I of course want to go back into the later period, because what's interesting is that while you've shown so effectively the dynamics in the 1100s and later into the 1200s, a myth, of course, is so wonderful because it survives. And what in the late Gothic Renaissance and on era made the Cid so appealing. I mean, the book, the volume, the Crónica del Cid, the 16th century, early 16th century incunable that's on view at the Grolier, has a print of the Cid on his horse, which is also a recreation of the Santiago Matamoros. And to come to the facade, I wondered to what extent that was what the whoever carved that image over the door you showed was the source for that. I mean, but what it does show, regardless of which comes first, the print, the facade, it does show that it, the militaristic Christian culture continues to equate the two, or maybe because there isn't an iconography of the Cid, they have to go with what they know, and they come to adapt the Santiago. But the later history is also kind of curious. I mean, we talked before about the monastery and its facade, and I mean, if everyone says that's 18th century, I look at it and I just don't see that. I mean, and I don't know. You
I
haven't.
agree with I agree with you, but you're the expert. You're
No,
the
no, no. I'm not the expert there. There's as I listened to you with the detailed history of the moment and how this is interpreted and reinterpreted as the time goes on. It's a funny thing, because on the one hand, you have Charlton Heston, and you have Aznar, which shows how it transcends the immediate Burgos. But on the other hand, it's a very local, and it's strong to Burgos. And yet, someone who didn't make an appearance in this is Fernan Gonzalez.
That's true. And that's another person who has almost identical iconography.
Yeah, and the question of, I mean, the Great Gate in Burgos, the Arco of Santa Maria, has got both of them there. I mean, and that in the 16th century was a bit of monument making in part with an eye towards Charles V. And so they're reaching back, and yet why, there's also a medieval poem of Fernan Gonzalez. His monastery Arlanza doesn't do quite as well. And so it's this black hole sort of in the 16th, 17th, 18th century about the monastery that the facade sort of calls out to. And I thought it was very interesting, the red and the white alternating stones, how that's been picked up from the cloisters and put on the facade. And that has to have been intentional, and it has to have been with the symbolic significance, but it doesn't mean anything unless you've actually taken the tour of the monastery and seen the cloister and heard the stories.
I think that the red and white stones started to get it. They had an immediate visual reference on the Iberian Peninsula of the Great Mosque of Cordova, which becomes then it just becomes a reference for a kind of reductive Islam at a certain point, right? And so I think that's what allowed that to continue to be significant, even though we couldn't go in and see the cloister, as you say. The other thing is that senior moment. Hold it. The other thing is that that's a period in the research. So the 17th century is when there's an attempt to actually canonize the Cid, and the papacy canonizes the fictive 300 martyrs whose blood seeps up evidently into the cloister once a year, but it doesn't canonize the Cid. So I think there's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes in that period too, maybe.
Well, the Cid would fail. The 17th century is fairly rigorous in its saint-making process. There's the wonderful essay by Peter Burke, How to Be a Counter-Reformation Saint. You have to demonstrate the miracles. They have to be proven. And in all the sources give no miracles, no proof of, the military achievement doesn't count as a miracle. You have to have done something that passes muster, the same way the Alfonso El Sabio's got all the miracles of the Virgin, or the Santo Domingo has got his miracles. There's no evidence. So they can try, but they're going to face a very stiff opposition. The other 17th century saints from Spain who were canonized in the 17th century, Teresa, Ignatius of Loyola, that's all documented, proven, because in wonderful bureaucratic fashion, the steps are there, you go through them and you demonstrate it. So it's interesting that they thought they could try, and I'd be curious to know who in Spain was behind it apart from the monastery, because you would have needed some royal or ecclesiastical sponsorship to present it to Rome.
I'll check that out for you. I'll email you.
I also liked the wood engraving from that 19th century English or American book that you showed of the tomb, and that's another. For someone who did a dissertation on funerary monuments, the Cid is also in an odd way there, because even though he's buried there, there isn't a tomb. The history of his tomb is not at the same scale or the same way as some of the others. You go to Burgos, of course, and just a little further down that road that takes you to San Pedro, you've got the monastery, the Carthusian charter house of Miraflores, where Isabel and Ferdinand paid great wads of money for Isabel's parents and her brother. And that's a very politically motivated monument, and it's very beautiful. And the contrast between that tomb and the tomb that the Cid gets stands out. And I was struck that somebody took the trouble to make a wood engraving of that in a later book, and I'm curious to track that down just to see where that comes and what comes of that.
Patrick, tell us about the tomb itself.
Well, that I don't really know that much about it. It seems to be a 16th century monument, and I haven't had a chance really to look at the documents on that. And I mean, the strange thing about Burgos seems to be that although a powerful economic center in the second half of the 15th century and early in the 16th century, it recedes in importance. It falls off the trade routes. It doesn't enjoy the same power and prestige. The markets in the 16th and 17th century are more in Valladolid, Medina del Campo, and Burgos doesn't enjoy the same economic clout. And that too is interesting. I mean, I wonder to what extent that may be shaping the subsequent history of the Cid in this time period, which makes that facade. I mean, everyone agrees that it's 18th century. It makes it interesting that someone had the money for that, although stylistically and visually, it looks to me more 17th century, and that relief is a puzzle. And it's also possible that the relief already existed in the 16th century and they just expanded and built around it. But still, there's something very particular going on there, because I come back to that red and white alternating stone. That's not common in any shape, way, or form, and it's local to the place. So there has to be something there, and
well, people are saying it's 18th century because there's an inscription saying 1752, but it could so easily have been added later,
Well, I mean, no, something happened there in 1752 that I don't dispute, but what exactly it was and what was there before is
but I agree with you
up
that
for grabs.
the sculpture looks like it's from another world.
Well, but it's also heavily weathered, and the comparison you had with the Santiago from Burgos is very interesting, because you can see an 18th century sculptor, but of course there's a difference between working in wood on a smaller scale and stone, and the stone is, as I say, worn. It's just the rest of the building doesn't look very elaborate. I mean, maybe it's just a very simple and modest architecture, but they also had in the convent, in the monastery, a monk who was an architect, and they were proud of him. But 1752, it's if you think of the other major facades on doors at that period in Madrid, in Murcia, in Valencia, it's a much more extravagant Baroque architecture, and this is more severe and restrained in the style of what was being done in the 17th century. I mean, Gomez de Mora, and I don't know, but I'm not sufficiently versed enough to say more than that. I'm just saying that it doesn't look. But given the importance that the Cid is the prime relic, so to speak, of the monastery and its raison d'etre, there's something there. I mean, it's also got his coat of arms, on it. That's his coat of arms above it. So, it's a powerful linking to the figure, and it's there's something that they're obviously proclaiming his importance.
Well, it's great to chat with you about it for sure.
Do we have any questions from our friends on the watching?
Yes. So one question we have is, what are the contemporary perceptions of El Cid in current day Spain and abroad?
I recently read a really interesting, actually news article that talked about the fact that that different perceptions of, so El Cid has been sort of for a while representing that more limited image of what Spanish identity is that I spoke about. But but for instance, there's the author Perez Reverte, who has come out and written a new book, a new novel, imagining the life of El Cid, and he's pushing back against the notion that El Cid represents this kind of monochromatic, unitary kind of Spanish or Castilian identity, without without the kind of diversity of experience that we know. And then there's this new television series, which also is trying, in a pretty maladroit way, to say the same thing. Although the way that they have to, interject various romances and sensual encounters, it doesn't make a lot of sense historically. But anyway, we'll it, I guess it makes it more interesting as a television series. But I guess what I'm saying is the image of El Cid as a hero who was sort of upholding this mythic image is now breaking apart, and different groups are trying to repossess him as a more complex figure. I can say for all except the most careful historians, and I'm not a historian of El Cid. I can say for all of these people who are viewing him now, he still kind of has a kind of symbolic reference.
Well, as you speak, three things occurred to me. The first, of course, is that myth he's in some ways the perfect embodiment of myth, because myth has to have some historical reality so that we can believe it, but it also has to leave breathing room to be molded and malleable as one wants and needs it. And this vague, all the unanswered questions leaves the room for the interpretation. And when you say about the sensual encounters and the distortions and the changes, of course, that's the conventions of the TV drama.
Yeah.
Being a fan of opera, I know that I certainly wouldn't want to get my English history of Queen Elizabeth or Mary Stuart from the opera, because they felt free to reinvent and reinterpret, because it was just basically the rough outline that they were going to flesh out to make the opera as they wanted it. And I think we have the same issue with the Cid. You have to accept that what you see on a docudrama is not history, it's entertainment.
Yes.
And the mistake there is very dangerous, because as they become more visually compelling, which is what Netflix wants,
Mm-hmm.
we say, oh, well, it must be real because it looks real. And that, of course, is very, very treacherous and tricky. The second thing about the transition of the Cid is that in Fletcher's book on In Search of the Cid, he begins by saying how under Franco, people who wanted to protest against Franco, they couldn't write graffiti maligning Franco, but they wrote graffiti maligning the Cid. And that was their way of getting at Franco. And that shows in a certain way how the image changes.
That's a wonderful anecdote, and that's great.
And the last thing, of course, is that the image of the three cultures and convivencia is itself being. It's interesting to see how the history of it and the sociology of it and the contemporary changes. And I haven't looked at the Perez Reverte book, but I've read many of his other things, and I think it's interesting. I'm going to look for it now, because he was a military correspondent, so he knows firsthand the violence of war, and that's always something that colors his view. I've had arguments, or not arguments, discussions of differing opinion because he wrote also a series, the Captain a la Triste, where he takes another look at the 17th century. And some of my friends in Spain, they who study the period, they don't like it at all, because they find that it is in some ways too old-fashioned in the stereotyping. But what does come through is a sense, because he brings this awareness of the moment and just the horror of war, that he can capture a visceral quality to it that would make I think the Cid very interesting, because too often when you have these figures of myth, that sort of day-to-day immediacy gets lost in that way. And he's also very good at spotting questions of moral ambiguity. And as we've heard in the beginning, the Cid has got more than his fair share of moral ambiguity. So I think it would be very interesting to look at that in light of some of the other interpretations that have come out.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We have one more question, and I just want to ask the audience that if there's any other questions that you'd like answered, now is the time to leave it in the live chat. But our second question is, can you further explain the relationship between St. James and El Cid? So I think you spoke about it a little bit before, but maybe why was St. James specifically chosen as depicted as the Moor Slayer?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Because there was a tradition that St. James had come miraculously to evangelize Spain. And St. James already had a really important, had a really important relic, or he had a really important pilgrimage center in Santiago de Compostela. So and then Patrick can tell you a little more about the relationship of St. James with identity. So he was felt to belong to the Iberian Peninsula. So then a series of legends about his appearance to King Ramiro II at a very key moment started to be picked up by really important chroniclers like Rodrigo Jimenez de Rada, and then they developed it. But it really took off as an iconography in the 13th century. So the 13th century is the time and when a lot of people start to coalesce on the Iberian Peninsula in a more systematic way around the notion of maybe crusade or reconquest. And that's a whole nother subject, and I'm not going to say anything more about it because it would take me hours. Patrick?
Well, I would say it's a very interesting comparison. I mean, the first thing is you have to think practically like an artist, which is I need to create an image of the Cid. I have no models. What do I do? And I have St. James the Moor Slayer at hand. I'll go with that. What's one Christian attacking the infidel versus another? They're both knights, and as a caballero is nothing without his caballo. So, but the curious thing about the Santiago is that yes, he is associated with Galicia, but there's sort of a radical shift in his iconography. I mean, there's a wonderful book by Francisco Marquez Villanueva about the trajectory of Santiago, and the legend of the Battle of Clavijo is with Ramiro, and it's about in the 900s. But previously, the legend is not so sure what exactly he did, what his persona is. And as you said, Jerry, it's only picked up later that he becomes military and crusading. And the earliest images of him on the horse, I think you're looking at a print by Schongauer in the 15th century. So again, we're in these.
He's in the north. He's in the north transept of Santiago.
Yes, yeah, but you're in those yeah, he's in the north transept, which is very not prominent. It's you're in these uncharted waters of what's happening, sort of bubbling below the surface, and what gets put into art front and foremost,
Right.
because it takes off. I would say it's a 15th and 16th century phenomenon, and when you look at actually the 15th and 16th century are quieter moments until Ferdinand and Isabel decide that they're going to finish off the job against Granada. And
Yeah.
there's this funny disconnect. And as we were talking before, the Cartas Ejecutorias, these letters patent of nobility, are dating from the late 16th and early 17th century. And the image of Santiago that you see there, the one that we know of the man on the horse,
Mm-hmm.
is relating probably to the personal agenda of the people who are filing for the letter of patent of nobility.
Yeah.
And do they have a tie to the Order of Santiago, or are they, so it's again the murky waters of the subconscious of perhaps a collective nation, and
I love that.
the realization as it manifests itself in an artistic expression is very difficult unless you happen to know the exact details regarding the commission and the art itself.
Yeah, it's really interesting now that you mention it. So in the medieval period, Santiago appears on a horse with a sword early, but the dismembered bodies of Muslims beneath his horse's feet begins in the later period that you're discussing. So that's really interesting.
Oh.
Wonderful, thank you. We have one last question, and I think then we'll have to wrap things up. The question is, what was Archer Huntington's fascination with El Cid, and why do you think he chose his figure on Ottoman terrace?
Do you want me to answer that, or?
I certainly do.
Oh, I mean, Archer Huntington came to Spain. Well, he came to Spain because he read George Burroughs' Tsinkali. He, I guess, he grew up with, what a well-educated American, he was born 1870, would have. So I imagine there was a dose of the medieval world of chivalry there. But he became fascinated with the medieval culture of Spain, and the Cid embodied, I think, a lot of the adventurous and chivalric qualities that he admired. He also was a great lover of Spanish literature, and so he recognized the value and its significance of the Poema de mi Cid, the manuscript that you started with, Jerry. And you called it a translation. It's a translation and a critical edition, and it lists variants. It's in 3 volumes. And the great Hispanist Ramon Menendez Pidal, who published his own critical edition, wrote a review of Huntington's in which he was quite complimentary to Huntington. So it was a combination of his love of Spain, his love of literature, his love of, he had a real appreciation of the various cultures that made up medieval Spain, which is why the Hispanic Society has such a significant collection of Islamic art, the textile that you showed, for example. But we have other Islamic things, the ivory coffer and capitals, the azulejos, the ceramics, all of which reflect the impact of the Islamic culture in Spain. And he was aware of that. And the Cid, therefore, was something that was central to his view of Spain, his view of Spanish culture. But its presence on the terrace, it's not isolated. It's got the 4 figures around it, but it's also in conjunction with the 2 stone reliefs that Anna also carved of Don Quixote, the great figure of Spanish literature, and Boabdil, the last Moorish monarch of any part of Spain, Granada, who was evicted in 1492 by the Catholic kings. So the image that you had at the beginning is something that Huntington really admired, and it's close in that interpretation to what Huntington wanted for the Hispanic Society.
Patrick, I've learned so much giving this tertulia with you. Thank you. No, thank you so very much. And I want to make sure that everybody listening who's left over goes and sees your exhibition. It's the most beautiful exhibition of polychrome sculpture, just an amazing thing of a unique collection.
Thank you so much, Jerry. Thank you for the presentation, and I've enjoyed this too. Thank you to our members for a wonderful tertulia tonight. We encourage you to visit our website for a full list of the programs and events in celebration of this occasion. You can also visit the Grolier Club at 47th East 60th Street to view the current exhibition of treasures from the Hispanic Society Library, which features the manuscript that we saw, and also the incunable that I referred to, the Crónica of El Cid, along with 100 other items, manuscripts, printed material, medieval charters, holograph royal letters, sailing charts, letters patent of nobility, some of which you saw here too, books of hours, and the indigenous manuscripts from the Americas, which have got some things that we would never have a chance to see otherwise. And in the process of doing the exhibition, they've found fascinating new material that is explained in the label. So it's an excellent show, and I encourage everyone to go see it. I would also be thrilled if you would go and see the Gilded Figures Wooden Clay Made Flesh, as Jerry just said, at the Hispanic Society Museum and Library, which is open from Thursday to Friday, 12 to 6 at the museum's East Building Gallery until January 9th. More information will be on our website. Thank you so much, and good night.